Welcome to another episode of the MMA Beat. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. You know these guys. That's Jeff Wagenheim of SI.com, and that's Chuck Mindenhall of MMAfighting.com. And I know you're thinking right off the bat, where's the fourth? Well, we were expecting to have Luke Thomas, the fourth member of the A-Team, here today, but unfortunately, due to Tuesday's tragic Amtrak train accident, he has been left stranded in Washington, D.C. So for the first time in the MMA Beat's history, we have a panelist joining us via the phone. Luke, are you there?
I'm here. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you just fine. No truth to the rumor that you're still licking your wounds because of last night's very bad night in Washington, D.C. sports history, right?
Had to go there right off the bat.
How about those Knicks, Ariel Helwani? How about those Knicks?
Let's go Rangers. All right, guys. Great to have you, Luke, via the phone. Guys, great to have you here in studio. We have a lot to discuss, as always. And I want to start with a fight that is very important. It's a fight that we've been talking about for years, yet it's just days away. And I feel like a lot of people don't know this fight is happening. It's Uriah Faber versus Frankie Edgar. It's headlining a UFC Fight Morning show on Fox Sports 1 from Manila. And it's amazing. I've been waking up all week, and it's bizarre. Like, I wake up at 7 a.m., and the media day happened while we were all sleeping. The workouts happened while we were all sleeping. It's like, what is going on here? And I feel, truthfully, 2 days out, that there hasn't been enough promotion for this fight. The buzz is not there, and it should be there. Has the UFC dropped the ball?
I'm not sure that how they were going to carry the ball in this one. It seems like they, just by virtue of the way it's scheduled. I mean, the timing of it, where the fight is being held, when it's being held, all those things are. I suppose they could have done some more, but circumstances have gotten in the way. I mean, the bigger stories have kind of jumped out there. We talked about this last week. You know how every week beginning of the week we're thinking about what we're going to talk about on a Thursday, and all of a sudden stuff just comes at us. And I think that a lot of that stuff that came at us over the last few weeks is stuff that came at the UFC as well. It seemed like early on they were trying to promote this fight, but yeah, it's as you said, a lot of the things happened while we were asleep, and that's a perfect analogy. I feel like we were coming in today, and we were discussing when the actual fight card is happening. We were remembering that it's in the morning, not at night. I was trying to remember. Wait, is this a Fox Sports 1? Is this a fight card? It was like all the little details, which seem small. The important thing is that Frankie Edgar and Uriah Faber are stepping in the cage. That's the important thing. But really, the important stuff is, when is it happening? Where are you going to see it? Because that's what's going to get people to tune in or not.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's sort of the fill-it in Manila, isn't it? Sort of that's how it sort of seems. Like we're just we're padding until we get to UFC 187 or something like that. But I agree with you 100%. It's funny that these things start to glare at you, that you think, man, they finally get this really great fight. Maybe after some other cards where you don't get the fight even close to this caliber, where you have two guys who the partition has come down. It would be considered a super fight in its own way, just because you got two former champions. One who not so long ago was the best pound-for-pound fighter in the game, according to Dana White. The other one who's been the sort of kingpin for the smaller weight classes for so long. And you finally get that together, and here we are talking about it not really receiving the type of hype that it did. But I guess in some ways, it's cool that they are doing this from Manila, a place that they're, you like to see them break into a market like that where they do have a loyal, like from what we understand, a very loyal and passionate fan base. Would you like to see it? So I'd love to see the UFC get behind this, but this sort of extends almost to like UFC 188 even. We were contemplating that one. You're like, man, you virtually hear nothing. You've got your heavyweight championship on that. So I feel like they're just picking and choosing the fights that the cards that they want to promote, and unfortunately, this isn't one of them.
The filler in Manila, ladies and gentlemen. Chuck Mindenhall.
Yes, trademark that. Luke, what do you make of the promotion?
Yeah, I'm not exactly surprised by it necessarily. I know that's the most cynical thing to say on the internet these days, but I mean, look, realistically, we mentioned before the challenge is, I think even in a globalized age, it's easy to air these events. It's not so easy to get all audiences to care at all times. And I think so, part of it is just this sort of like cognizance that you just can't get when something is happening, and for most UFC fans around our neck of the woods in a remote place of the world, even if it's an important emerging market. I think that's part of it. I think the second part of it is I don't really expect them to do a lot of promotion. Even if they promoted the hell out of it, it's going to air on the main card at 10 a.m., which is 7 a.m. on the West Coast, on Fox Sports 1. You're just wasting money if you tried to promote it a lot. I'm not saying they could have done more, but realistically, how much more could they have done? Probably not a lot. The event is only going to make so much money. Why extend yourself for the purposes of honoring the main event? And I'm not saying the main event's not worthy of being honored, but there's just restraints on what you can realistically do here. I just think it's kind of funny because it's an event like this where you have a really cool main event, an important one, a fun one. It's the main event and the people's main event at the same time in some ways, right? And then it totally explodes the argument that these events, I mean, I know this is airing on Fox Sports 1, but that these overseas events aren't for us. It's like, that argument was terrible before. It's completely untenable now.
Don't you feel like this kind of fight, I remember when Conor McGregor fought Diego Brandao, and that was a Fight Pass show last summer, and they actually did a countdown for it, and that was a big deal. And remember, Conor was talking about this. He was like, "Oh, look, they're doing a countdown show for a Fight Pass main event."
Right.
I feel like this is the kind of fight that needed maybe not your typical countdown show, but it needed. I mentioned this on Monday. HBO did a fantastic 1-hour show called At Last about Mayweather-Pacquiao. It needed a 1-hour special where you talk to pundits, where you don't really talk about what they're doing today to prepare, but you talk about their careers and how they start. And they have all this footage. They have footage from the old school WEC. They have early Frankie Edgar stuff. They can go out and get it, certainly, with their connections. And you talk about their careers up until this point and how we've actually been talking about this fight for 5 years. At last, two of the greatest of all times are going to actually fight. You know what I mean? I felt like it needed something like that, and I don't see any of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I look at the flip side of it, and I think, well, why would the UFC have not done that? Is it because they have there's this big fight card a week later?
Yeah.
They don't want to, they don't want to devote all the energy to this, or is this just one of those fights that is for the diehards? And if you follow the sport devotedly, you know what this is about. You know that you're going to be sitting there in front of your TV on Saturday morning. You're not going. You've already set yourself a message for Saturday morning to not miss it. I feel like that's kind of the thing. That's how I look at it. This might, unlike say a Conor McGregor fight where they're reaching beyond the MMA diehards to try to pull in a whole different crowd. It seems like this was one of those ones that's like, this is for you guys. These are the folks, all you folks out there that have been watching the sport forever. We're going to throw this one out because I think if they were trying to really go bigger with this, they probably wouldn't have sent it off, out into the Philippines and put it on in the morning.
Yeah, I get that because it's a new market and you want to open those doors and you want to put. I mean, historically, first event in a new market does very well, and that's important to note because maybe you could say, this market didn't need that fight because it would have done well regardless.
Right.
If this fight was next week, Memorial Day weekend in the U.S. on pay-per-view, I feel like people would have legitimately, it's very rare these days for people to buy a pay-per-view because of the fourth fight on the pay-per-view. This is one of those times where if it would have been below Cerrone Nurmagomedov, I think people would have gone out of their way to say, I need to see Frankie Edgar and Uriah Faber. They could have made money off of this fight.
Sure, but I guess that's sort of what I'm getting at in a kind of roundabout way, that the UFC made a decision that we want to have this, we want to put this fight on for the fans, and but we're also putting it on a fight card that's happening at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, the main card here in the East, and it's on and a generally inconvenient time for fight fans, or a time that is not generally the prime time for fight fans, and it's a conscious thing. If this were a nighttime main event and they were not doing much to promote it, I'd have probably a different feeling about it. But I feel like they've kind of already laid the groundwork for this.
I'm just stoked that it's happening. I mean, ultimately, when it really comes
Maybe
down
we're
to
nitpicking.
it, when it really comes down to it, you're like, this fight got made, and I really don't care in some ways what time it's happening. For a long time, I just wasn't sure that it would come together, because we have been talking about this fight. I remember asking both of those guys a couple of years ago about the potential of facing one another, and we remember there was somebody took a picture of them squaring off at one point at like the expo and all that stuff. It's just crazy how quiet it's kind of gotten here that we're at the point where they're going to do it, and I think that's why we're nitpicking. It just seems like it should have some bells and whistles behind it, but ultimately, man, it's just. It's now that we're here, now we're at the spot. It's just fun to kind of contemplate those guys getting in there together.
Luke, you mentioned, why should the UFC put money into this fight? Especially, they had the conference call yesterday for 187. They're going to make money off of the pay-per-view. These cards are already, bought and paid for, and I get that. Do you think maybe it's on the TV network? Is it on Fox Sports 1 to, go out of their way and say, wow, we got something special here. We need to do something on our own to let people know that this massively important fight historically is happening this Saturday morning?
Could be. I mean, obviously, it's a reward for their television partner. I mean, a fight like this is it's not headlining a first-time event in the Philippines by accident. They didn't draw it out of a hat. They made this fight. They said, we got to go into Manila with a boom. Who knows what will happen in the fight, but I think every expectation is that one way or the other, it's going to deliver. I just think it all harkens back to, everyone gets tired of the argument. They don't want to hear it anymore. Sorry, folks, oversaturation is real. You just got to accept it. It's just not possible to promote all fights in all places all the time. You have to make sacrifices. You have to take shortcuts sometimes. And sometimes good things don't get the treatment. The show you're talking about, Ariel, At Last, you can get it on YouTube now. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty spectacular. You got to go out there and see it, but it's because they had time to massage and work and make things happen. When you're running from deadline to deadline and parts of the globe to parts of the globe, that's just not possible. I'm glad they took it off Fight Pass because I think Fox Sports 1 is probably like, hey, this would be better for us in prime time, but we're happy to take it earlier in the day. It'll still do good ratings for us. It'll still be good lead-in program to whatever else happens in the afternoon. But, Fox Sports 1 doesn't have NBA or NHL playoffs, so they need what they can get during this time of year. So it's definitely a boon for them. But I just think it all harkens back to people can deny it all they want. Oversaturation's real.
Before I ask you about UFC 187, Luke, I just have to say, as a father of two very young boys, this start time is fantastic for me. I mean, this is my prime time. This couldn't be better. Saturday morning, 8 a.m. prelims, 10 a.m. main card. I mean, this thing's gonna be done by 1. This is fantastic. I can't ask for anything more. But that's me, and I don't think historically, especially on the West Coast, they like these kind of start times.
I was thinking the same thing when you were asking it earlier. I was thinking, well, selfishly, I love this. I love this. I mean,
it's wonderful.
Aside from being a father, being with kids, I always love sports during the day. I love a weekend. When I'm watching the NFL in the fall, I love the 1 o'clock games. I hate the 4 o'clock games, and I really hate the 8 o'clock games. The 1 o'clock on Sunday is prime time for football, and not to say that whatever time Edgar and with Faber actually step in the cage, whatever it'll be like about 1 o'clock
or
10 o'clock,
like 12.
noon.
Yeah, it'll be around 12.
Whatever. That's not going to be the prime time for all fights, obviously. But it works for me.
Luke, you're one of the few MMA guys these days that follows and covers boxing. You were at Pacquiao Mayweather. You were there on the scene. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And here we are, a little over a week away from UFC 187, which is still a very, very good card for the UFC. 2 titles on the line. Can't wait for Weidman, Belfort. We've been waiting for this for a long time. Do you think that now that the pay-per-view numbers are out for Pacquiao Mayweather, historic numbers probably in our lifetime, I mean, I have a hard time believing that those will be broken anytime soon, over 4 million buys, at least as of last count. Do you think that there'll be a trickle-down effect, or do you believe at this stage 2 separate audiences, the UFC fans are going to target this 187 card and say, this is a card that I need to buy?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't think that UFC 187 is a good card. I think it's a great card. Yeah. And it's one that they, I think, have promoted pretty effectively, even with bad luck with John Jones and then bad luck with Habib and whatever else the case may be. So they deserve a compliment when it comes to that. So I actually don't think it's going to affect it much. Now, that isn't to say that the pay-per-view buy rates are going to be what they were. I do think the loss of Nurmagomedov, not that he's a pay-per-view star, but if people were waffling, losing him versus Cerrone kind of hurts. McDessie's the best they can do, and I think that fight will be cool, but doesn't have the same stakes. And Nurmagomedov was on this hot streak and certainly was talking a lot on Twitter. And I think losing that kind of will factor into decision making. Cormier versus Johnson is a first-rate main event by any circumstance and measurement. But losing John Jones, I think, does hurt a little bit too. So if the pay-per-view buy rates are affected, it's going to be hard. We'll have to see what the numbers are in the end. I do think they'll be affected, but I really don't believe that the 4.4 million buys, as unbelievable and astronomical as it is really going to be have an effect. There's been a bit of a distance now. People have gotten a couple of paychecks since then, maybe. True. And I also feel like the 4.4 million. It's not all MMA fans and boxing fans and kickboxing fans. It's a few MMA fans. It's a lot of boxing fans. It's a ton of sports fans. It's a ton of people. Like, look who's at that fight.
Yeah.
Paris Hilton, and you know, other you know, social zeros and Barnacle like that. But I just mean, it's people who otherwise would never pay attention taking a look, and I think you got a lot of their dollars, which is why there's this huge over-representation of buys.
What do you think, Chuck? Do you think there'll be a hangover effect?
Not really. And then actually, to Luke's point, I remember I even asked Luke, I was like, how many MMA people were sort of coming at him with this boxing stuff? And he said not as many in his chat and things like that. And I just think that the line is just different. I think it's just a different sport. Over time, I think that that's sort of shown itself. And I don't think the disposable income or whatever you want to call it that would go to these type of things will be affected for the UFC event particularly. But the thing that starts to affect the UFC card in general is just how many alterations we get of these types of cards. And even though I agree with Luke 100% on the main event, still very compelling, I feel like the Khabib fallout, you know, that sort of hurts it, you know, in this weird way. I feel like that's really where they get affected. It's like I think people want the cards to stay intact the way that they see them made. And when these things start to happen, I think that's really where it gets affected. But I really don't believe that the Pacquiao Mayweather fight's going to affect it that much.
Yeah, I think it's totally different audiences. I mean, really significantly different audiences. And I mean, I know that one of the reasons why you would bring that up is obviously the number of people who bought Pacquiao Mayweather, and also the amount that they had to pay for it. And it is, you know,
I just got my cable bill yesterday, and it was $100 more. Like, whoa.
Okay, so there's your example. But
Yeah.
I would say that what my example would be, I think, probably more common. I didn't get a $100 bill on my cable. I went to a party and I tossed $10 into a hat, and there were a whole bunch of us at that house, and we watched the fights. I think there are, you know, certainly that's the way that I used to watch boxing pay-per-views back in the day, and certainly when they're $100 and you're, you know, and you're a peripheral fan of boxing at best, because we know that if there are 4 million buys, you're getting peripheral fans. You're not getting, you know, 4 million diehard boxing fans. I don't think that exists. So you're gonna. I think there are a lot of people who just, you know, who chipped in, and so I don't think that that's necessarily even the money amount is going to cause people to not buy UFC fights if they choose to. I just think that the promotional train sort of got slowed down by all this other stuff that's going on. I mean, John Jones's story should have been John Jones preparing for a big fight. Instead, it was John Jones, you know, getting, you know, on the loose. Then John Jones in court. Then John Jones being stripped, and then that's been the story. And oh yeah, there's the fight still going on with two other guys. You know, it's almost like that's been the story. I mean, I haven't seen hardly anything other than on the real, you know, MMA sites about DC and Johnson. You don't see.
I think those two top fights are worth $60. I mean, in particular, Weidman Belfort, since we've been waiting for it for so long. And, you know, I just want to, I mean, we haven't seen Belfort fight since November of 2013. What's he going to look like? Especially in this day and age with no TRT, must be said. And Weidman's had his injuries as well. He hasn't been very active. So those top two fights for me are very, and let's not forget, you got Travis Brown, Andrei Arlovsky, Benavidez Moraga. The prelims are very good, the return of Uriah Hall. So I like the card very much. Luke, I'll go back to you and ask you about that pay-per-view number, because I'm wondering in our lifetime, when it's all said and done, forget about boxing. Let's include MMA, let's include pro wrestling, let's include kickboxing, anyone who wants to try pay-per-view. Will we ever see any kind of entity surpass 4.4 million buys, excuse me?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah.
No. Scott Christ, who is the boxing editor for Bad Left Hook and obviously does some of the work on SBNation.com, one of our sister sites here at the company, he wrote before the fight, and quite presciently, I think, he argued that, like, look, we don't know what this was, again, before the fight. We don't know how many buys it's going to do, but it's expected to break records and be amazing. And he argued that he thought in retrospect, once the fight was over and the numbers were in, we might look at that as not just a high watermark of pay-per-view, but it's swan song. You know, we're looking at a time now where the unbundling of cable is slowly happening, or at least the rebundling in the internet age, taking different forms. And people are getting all kinds of new subscription services, even companies like Metamoris, which is frankly like a startup still in many ways. They're offering online subscriptions. So people's disposable income for these kinds of things is getting pulled and stretched in a lot of different and myriad and interesting ways. And pay-per-view itself, as we know, is on the decline. I don't think that where we've seen our last million pay-per-view buy rate for anyone by any stretch of the imagination. But when you look at the circumstances here, pay-per-view is still viable enough. You have a 5-year incubation period for a fight between two of the biggest and biggest stars and biggest box office attractions, one of which is the highest paid athlete in sports. You just have to ask yourself, before pay-per-view finally goes out of business or wanes as a medium that's effective, who on earth can replicate those circumstances? And I think Scott Crisp was totally right, and I have a very, very hard time imagining any scenario where someone beats that.
I don't think anyone could beat it, but it has reassured me that pay-per-view, while it feels like this, dinosaur model, actually still works. I mean, if people are actually going to go out of their way and seek this and spend $100, that's a historic number in its own right. Wow, I guess it works. At the end of the day, people will buy it.
It's like if you have something that's that coveted, and it's almost like it's just an association at some point, or just it's infectious. Even if you're not watching boxing, you hear just enough of Mayweather, like he was talking about the incubation period, you hear enough about the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight not happening. There's so many people complaining, it'll never happen, it'll never happen. So finally it happens, and that's why that number gets to where it is, because there's all this intrigue on every level. Just from the most casual person who's just like been hearing about it, just hearing those names for so long coming together. Well, it seems like a fight of our lifetime, suddenly it's the fight of our lifetime. So in my mind, I don't think we ever get near that number again, just based on those circumstances.
Yeah, I would say maybe Floyd Manny 3 might, maybe that's the one that's going
yeah.
No, actually, off what Chuck just said, the idea that on the one hand you've got a fight that just happened that we thought was never going to happen, right? The boxing rings, and then you mentioned, of course, the UFC middleweight fight that we've been waiting for a long time. But there's a subtle difference there, and I think that might play into something here. On the one hand, the Weidman Belfort fight was supposed to happen, and then it sort of got pushed back. And when we're waiting for something that we're being told is going to happen, we have a different mindset, I think, than where we're told that something's never going to happen, and all of a sudden it materializes out of nowhere.
You're right.
Yeah, I'm just so broken up that Luke's not here. I mean,
it is it is a little lonely here without Luke.
Spacious
better,
though. I like it.
Yes,
I got
very
lots of room
spacious,
here.
Luke. You'll be happy to know we have a lot of elbow room. I'm just going to put a bow on this discussion and say once again, sometimes I in particular receive heat for saying, oh, I like the theatrics, the WWE stuff. Faber Edgar, once again, is the kind of fight where I didn't need to see them square off. I didn't need to see them talk smack.
True.
Even this kind of at-last documentary thing that I'm suggesting, I don't want to see any trash. These two guys, I just feel like we've been dreaming about this for so long, and it's so rare that it actually materializes without any bad blood or anything like that. Like, I just want to see what will happen. The sight of them in the cage together is enough to really get me excited.
Sometimes the imagination, that's all you need.
Yeah.
Because you can't, it's hard to get them together. That's the problem. They're in different weight classes. Their trajectories are not going toward one another, even though you want to see it. And then finally it happens. It opens up, and it just lets your imagination take
And they
over.
kind of remind me of a more innocent time. Like when we really started to get into the sport, and they're throwbacks, and they're first ballot Hall of Famers, whatever you want to call them. I mean, I think it's a real special treat. And I guess kind of, and I'm 100% nitpicking. I shouldn't even care about this stuff because it's such an exciting fight. I just wish it was getting a little more attention at the end of the day.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. And I'll probably get in trouble with diehard fans for saying this, but I actually am more excited to see those two guys go at it than I am to see either of the two title fights the week after. Now, those title fights are amazing, and they're going to be great, and the combination of them makes that card something worth seeing. But just to see, I mean, I've always loved watching Frankie Edgar compete because you always know that he's not invulnerable. You know that we've seen it. The first round, he gets his clock knocked off of his head, and then he managed to come back. And Faber is just such an aggressive guy, and we've seen him get taken out by Barao and some others, but he just never stops.
Usually
he never
shows
stops.
up though in all the fights that are not for a belt.
That's
so
right,
that's an
right.
interesting.
Well,
side
and
note.
that's important to note because this fight doesn't need a belt, but it's still very important. I think if Frankie Edgar wins, he has a legitimate case of being the number one contender along with Chad Mendes. And if Faber wins at 145 over Edgar, he has a little thing with Conor as well. He has a history with Aldo. I mean, it's not just two old guys fighting for the sake of fighting. It's a very important fight. Luke, last week on the show, we devoted a lot of time to the Reebok deal. And now, this week, not a lot of huge news coming out as a result of it. I think we're still all kind of digesting it, but two interesting things have happened since. The first is the story that we broke on MMAfighting.com that next week in Las Vegas, some of the most powerful managers in the sport will be meeting, and they're all saying, you know, we'll talk Reebok, but it's not just about Reebok. Now, the timing is, you know, a little interesting. One has to assume it's going to be a major point of discussion, but I'm wondering what you make of all of this. Do you feel like this is a sign of things to come? Do you feel like, hey, wow, the manager is finally coming together, this is something the fighters should be doing? How did you digest this news?
I didn't think much about it, if I'm being totally honest.
Okay, fair enough.
For a lot
Next question.
Well,
go ahead.
Here's what I mean. I read the news, and it's certainly an interesting development in the sense that it's unprecedented. I just don't have a lot of faith that they're going to do a whole lot, and I would love to be wrong. Nothing would make me happier than being absolutely wrong, and nor would it be the first time that I'm utterly wrong. But, you know, my read on this thing was when the news first came out, there was a fair amount of consternation about what was happening. But, you know, if past this prologue, you have to ask yourself, what are the people in MMA going to do who are affected by this? They're going to do what they've always done, most likely, which is just take it. That's likely what's to happen. If it took this much for the managers to get together, they've waited too long already. You know, there has a lot that you could point to that has happened in the course of the development of mixed martial arts that the fighters working together in concert with UFC has brought to where it is. But, you know, that they didn't even fight back when they lost the ability to, for example, when they lost their likeness rights. I mean, that's unbelievable that they let that slide, you know. And now they have this going on, and certainly it's problematic because it, you know, affects your pocketbook each and every time, I suppose, depending on who you are. But no, I don't expect much out of it. I think they'll get together and meet, but I don't know that they can convince their clients en masse to do something about it. I don't know that they have the desire to put together a meaningful plan of action. Do they really want to challenge authority in some kind of way to get what they want? I have serious doubts about it, especially when you've got managers in the article saying, you know, they view bonuses as a gift and, you know, the UFC already pays them enough. That's not, you know, maybe that's just what he's saying publicly and he feels different privately, but that's not the kind of positioning you have to have to enact meaningful change. So I expect very little.
You know, managers in MMA oftentimes have been the butt of jokes, right? And people are like, these aren't real managers and things like that. I guess I'm just happy that they're working together. Quite frankly, I'd love to see the media do this. To me, it just kind of showed that we're growing up. The sport is evolving. We're only, you know, a little over 20 years old. It's nice to know that the managers who, if you've ever talked to a couple managers, you know they love to talk smack about each other, and there's this very competitive field and all that, and I get it. It's nice to see that if this actually comes to fruition and some real important, you know, players are involved, it's nice to see them come together and at least talk about, all right, what's the state of the business, because it is rapidly changing before their eyes.
Sure, but they'll remain the butts of jokes if nothing comes of it that is tangible. And you know, I like Luke, I really hadn't given a lot of thought to this meeting because I haven't thought that it just didn't occur to me that they could really work together to make significant change. But then as you were asking the question, and as Luke was talking, and I also thought about it a little bit more and realized, well, what did we talk about last week? But maybe this is an opportunity. This Reebok deal is an opportunity for fighters to maybe all realize simultaneously that, hey, you know, we need to have some kind of a connection with each other so we can all further our individual ways, financially and otherwise. And well, one step to getting fighters together, one shortcut might be to get managers together because each one of them represents several people. So it's kind of a shortcut way of perhaps getting something in motion with the fighters. And so unless something comes out of this that's tangible, that, you know, that we are going to take action and do something, then I just think it is a bunch of guys, you know, getting together and talking to each other.
Which I think is notable in its own right, by the way.
It's, I guess, I don't know. Maybe it's notable that
it's hard to get a lot of egos in the same room to talk about things, especially competitors.
But does that really matter? If nothing comes out of it that is going to bring the fighters together and get the fighters to work together.
Don't be such a cynic, Jeff. Rome wasn't built in a day. Chuck?
If nothing else, at least they're trying to get on the same page. I feel like in a dissociative sport like this, where you have everybody's individual, needs and whatever, it's hard for those types of people to communicate. And like you said, it's a lot of gamesmanship, I guess you would say. Like they've got their secrets of how they handle things with the UFC and versus.
Sure.
You put them in the same room, it makes some people uncomfortable. I would say that. The UFC might get a little uncomfortable by the idea just because you are getting a little bit more of a collective, a little bit more of an association. Who knows what comes of it, but ultimately it can't hurt. I just feel like, if they're talking about it, if they're trying to reach some common ground or have a collective understanding of how to proceed, if something good like that comes out of it, good for them. But ultimately I'm with Luke and you. I don't see much coming of it. I don't hold my breath that
I don't think the game will change, but I think it's noteworthy. Well, I like the fact that they're doing this.
Okay, I guess to reframe what I'm saying is that I think that we should hold this meeting to higher standards and higher expectations than we would if we heard that a bunch of fighters were going to get together.
Sure.
These are people who are professionals representing athletes. Whether they have little feuds with each other and petty stuff going on, and while they're going to sit together despite that doesn't interest me. These guys are professionals. We should hold them to high standards and say, okay, you guys are representing these fighters. You can make a difference. Fighters have very different lives and different expectations of what they're going to earn financially. But you are professionals at what you do. Do something.
Luke, the other byproduct came after Bellator announced that they had signed Ed Ruth, and I know this excited you greatly. Ed Ruth, if you follow collegiate wrestling, even casually, you've heard of this man, 3-time national champion from Penn State. He's also now become a figure in MMA even before the signing, training with the likes of Chris Weidman and most notably John Jones in preparation for his fight against Daniel Cormier. And in his statement, which was initially given to me from Bellator, he mentioned the Reebok deal, or at least he took a subtle shot at the Reebok deal, saying that he likes the fact, I'm paraphrasing, that he can get his own sponsors. Now, quite frankly, I feel like that was something that came from Bellator to take a subtle shot at their competitors, but he has since stuck to his guns in interviews and said that he feels like he can make more. I find this statement, and I want to get your take on it, to be a little strange because, as you know, Ed Ruth is going to try out for the Olympics, and I think a lot of people, and correct me if I'm wrong, think that he has a very good chance. That means he's only going to be fighting professionally in a couple of years minimum. Who the heck knows what the state of the Reebok deal is going to be? And this is a guy who has come out in many interviews, even his Twitter profile, stated that he wants to be a UFC champion. Are you really going to sign a contract? Is that what led you to sign this contract, or is this all gamesmanship? What did you make of all of it? Because I don't know. I'm calling BS on it.
That his motives were disingenuous, that he doesn't actually believe that the Reebok deal matters, that he was coached by it. Is that what you're suggesting?
Okay, your audio is a little messed up here, so maybe we could work on that. I don't know what happened. I think the gremlins took over. Or perhaps it was the ghost of Henrik Lundqvist. Are you there? Let's try one more time.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, much better, much better. Go ahead. What did you say? I missed it.
I think I understand your point. Here's what I would say. I would say that, look, did Bellator probably ask him to mention the Reebok deal in some capacity? Did they insert that language into the release that they gave to you and ultimately the one they issued after the fact? Maybe so. That would hardly surprise me. And to your point, first of all, he hasn't qualified for the Olympics yet, which is a bit of an unnerving thing because he was expected to cruise in his weight class. But let's say he does go to the Olympics and may or may not medal. To your point, the Reebok deal could look very different later on down the road. So all those things I think are fair rebuttals to what has happened here. But at the same time, I also don't view it as something totally dismissible. The reason why is because, David Taylor, one of Ed Ruth's teammates from Penn State, he has an Adidas sponsorship. He has like a headphone sponsorship as well. These guys are able to bring in things, and he hasn't gone to the Olympics yet either. Like, they're able to bring sponsors to bear that could matter. But I think it's more than that. Like, if you stay in the wrestling community and you excel at the level of an Ed Ruth or a David Taylor or a Kyle Dake or whatever the case may be, you're going to end up most likely coaching for the national team or, at a Division I program, and your family's taken care of and you're taken care of, and you stay at a part of the industry where everything is basically above board from an employee status. You look at fighters who've matriculated, or I should say wrestlers who've matriculated to fighting, and you look at a case like Mark Coleman. Mark Coleman was a beast wrestler, an Olympic wrestler, and then he comes over and now has to put up a GoFundMe page to pay for his hip surgery. There is something alluring, I think, to these guys who have seen the cycle of what happens one way or the other, that being in control of your destiny, having options is great. But more importantly, when you have the request for interviews stop and when the meetups at Dave & Buster's are over, the only thing you can take with you after the fact is cash. And either you're going to collect a lot of it or you're not. And obviously Bellator presented a package to him, at least at this juncture in his career, where he felt like I can do more probably at this stage of my career anyway, to make more to keep and secure my future. Now, who knows what will happen down the road? But I think those are real concerns you probably had.
Okay, so Chuck, let me ask you this. Do you think this is a sign of things to come? Do you think more guys are going to decide their future, where they're going to sign, based off of this deal?
Well, I thought that's what spoke loudest to me, honestly, was just seeing that he had been in contact, I'm guessing with the UFC, he had been in contact with other organizations, this according to him, which would make sense kind of being a prospect of where he's at coming up, for him to choose Bellator and to throw that in there. I don't really know. I can't read between the lines like you guys are trying to do here, but it does make me think that he's a guy who is determined to control his own future. You know, like Luke was saying, like he's a guy. You know, to me, he's a prospect that the UFC probably did want, and you know, for him to choose Bellator ultimately, after all the sort of negative stuff coming from this Reebok deal, it was sort of opens your eyes a little bit, because you realize now there is this extra component that you have to think about in terms of all of the, more than just competition, more than just facing the best guys in your weight class and all that. And it'd be really interesting to see if other people start to follow suit. This just being right on the heels of this whole Reebok thing, so it's like it's the most significant thing so far, I feel like, and it'd be interesting to see. Ultimately, I don't know, because change is very difficult. It's hard for people to take it out of their mind that the UFC is where it's at and all that. But maybe this is the first guy to start to do this, and we start to see more prospects, at least originally, before the free agents.
Yeah, I actually think, I don't know whether the Reebok deal is going to change. People who already exist in the UFC, they've got all kinds of complicated things, I imagine, with getting out of those contracts when those contracts ends and moving over. But in terms of prospects, they don't come around all that often. There are other top collegiate wrestlers and other athletes, I suppose. But this guy is a special one. I'm not a big collegiate wrestling follower, but I know who Ed Ruth is. So he's clearly he's a name within that world. And I actually think this is just a really good move for him. It's nice that he linked it to the Reebok deal, so he makes it seem as though he did it for that reason. But look, if you're a new guy, we've seen wrestlers, guys who were collegiate wrestlers, even Olympic wrestlers, come into MMA. Some of them have jumped right in and become top of the game people, and others have struggled a little bit to try to transition to round out their game. We don't know what he's going to look like when he jumps in there, but it's better that he's jumping in early on in his professional career against Bellator's competition than if he's jumping in against UFC competition. This is not to denigrate Bellator at all, but I think that we would recognize that it's certainly less depth in all of the weight classes. So he's going to have a little better chance of at least getting his sea legs before he starts reaching toward the top and seeing if he can get a championship belt.
I will say that Scott Coker is a hell of a recruiter. It's like, he seems to me, when he actually gets together with people and they have conversations about coming on board, he gets them excited. And he posted a picture on Twitter where he was with Aaron Pico and Ruth. So he was with these guys, and I feel like when he actually takes the time to go do that, there must be some persuasive powers that he uses on these guys. Because a lot of people, if you really talk to them, I feel like they form a rapport with Scott Coker. They trust him. I think they want to, be a part of what he's got going on. It's quite a feat, really, on the other level of what he's been able to do with Bellator, get people excited about fighting in Bellator, which, when he came in, was just in a completely different place, like a 180. Bellator sort of now more of the darling in the industry rather than the one that we were all pissing on. So it's an interesting turn.
Luke, two things really interest me about this deal. The first is this is the second time in the span of 6 months where Bellator has signed an athlete who has no plans of immediately fighting for them. The first was Aaron Pico. Everyone knows about him. Dave Meltzer wrote a great profile on him several months back. This is a young kid who has aspirations of going to the Olympics and all that. And so they're coming in on the ground floor. These guys have never fought before. No amateur fights, nothing. And they're saying, all right, we want to be in business with you, almost put you in our farm system, and we will develop you and be a part of your career in 2-3 years. When you're ready, you can come. And historically, as you guys know, the UFC hasn't made a habit of doing that, signing guys out of college or whatever. But times have changed. Of course, they recently signed CM Punk, who has no history. But even more interesting to me is the
amateur wrestler, wasn't he?
Yes, an accomplished one. Even more interesting to me is that in the last 6 months, the three biggest signings, in my opinion, that Bellator has made: Aaron Pico, as far as getting a lot of attention, Phil Davis, and now Ed Ruth. What do those three have in common outside of their wrestling credentials? Well, the most important thing that they have in common is that they all have the same management team, and that's Zinkin. And as we know, as we talked about on this show, Zinkin has had that history with Scott Coker. Bob Cook, who is a trainer over at AK, used to be a matchmaker for Strikeforce. He also still serves as a manager. Once again, we're seeing this relationship flourish where Zinkin, who back in the day funneled Luke Rockhold and Cain Velasquez and Daniel Cormier to Strikeforce, they seem to be doing the same thing now with Bellator, and I think that's a very interesting development. Now, I want to ask you, Luke, what do you make of Bellator doing this, signing these guys, when it's clear they're not going to fight for 2, 3, 4 years maybe? Do you like this approach, and what do you make of them doing it at this stage? Why not just wait? If you're an Olympic gold medalist, after doing the whole thing, you could probably command a lot more money. What do you make of them doing it at this stage?
Yeah, it is really interesting from the athlete side, to your point. Now, it's a little rather difficult to win an Olympic gold medal, so I wonder if they feel like if I get in as an Olympic qualifier or, a guy expected to get to the Olympics like Ed Ruth is, if I'm at my, not peak value, but pretty good value to, get some arm twisting done. I think that's probably it. I don't think that, by the way, Ruth is expected to medal, even if he makes the team. So just think about how deep the weight class is. So there's that as well. But I think it's super interesting because it's one thing to get Davis, who is basically more or less ready to rock. They could put him on a fight card pretty soon if they wanted to, right? Versus these guys who are, what do you want to call them? Developmental prospects, farm system kind of things. But I think it does a couple of things. Coker, I got the sense, because I spoke to him like last week, he didn't say anything to this effect, but I got the sense when I spoke to him that there's a palpable belief that the roster he inherited from Bjorn Rebney is a giant pile of S that he has to fix. And because he even joked that he doesn't have the ability to accommodate all the guys on roster that he has, that there's another bloodletting coming down the pike, and there's a lot more guys he wants to sign. So it's partly about just fixing what's already there. But I think he's trying to send signals to the world, not just to other prospects, but like when we took this operation over, it wasn't just a change of management or a new coat of paint. We're taking it in a different direction. And we really want to show you guys we are committed to not just putting on great shows and leveraging Spike TV and yada, yada, activating with all these sponsors. No, we're here to compete. We're here to sign really good guys. We're here to put on really important fights. And it may take us a while, but we're putting out all the signals early that a change is coming. A storm is brewing. And I don't know when it's going to hit shore, but it's on its way. And I think that is what they're trying to do, and to get other people to maybe start thinking differently. Because if you're just trying to sign free agents who are there, you're going to have a hard time. There's not many there. But if you can get on the ground floor and start planting seeds, eventually that will turn into trees.
Guys, let's end on this. Perhaps the biggest news story of the week has been, once again, Ronda Rousey. Her book, Ronda Rousey.
Oh, yeah.
Rowdy Ronda Rousey.
One, yeah.
Her book, My Fight, Your Fight, came out on Tuesday. I've read it. I think it was a great read. But more interesting, at least for our purposes, is the fact that, once again, she is breaking through these doors that the UFC has had a hard time breaking through. She's on the cover of Sports Illustrated. We will talk about that since that's the outlet you work for. In my opinion, even more significant was that she was on Howard Stern, who is not a UFC fan, who's had a weird relationship with the UFC in the past. Her book publisher, the same as Howard's book back in the day, Private Parts, so there's a relationship there, but I think that's a very important platform to be on given his audience. But this is just amazing. Once again, her book comes out. It appears to be a success, and she just, she's a guest on these shows and appearing on these platforms that the UFC historically has never had a chance to get on. There's only been one other MMA fighter on the cover of SI, but that was, that was a story on the UFC, and Roger Huerta. Yeah, Roger Huerta was the lucky guy, but it wasn't about Roger Huerta. So it's been an unbelievable week for her once again. I want to ask you about this process of her landing on the cover. Also significant to note, I mean, huge news coming out of the NFL, which we know, is really the moneymaker as far as media is concerned here in the United States. Tom Brady getting suspended and the fines and all that. I mean, no one would have been surprised if that was on the cover of SI, and yet she lands the cover. Of course, this was in the works. We know that, but still, I've heard of stories where people got pulled at the 11th hour when a bigger news story hits. So my point is, what I want to ask you about is this process. How long did you know about it? And last week we talked about on this show, you putting her as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, and this has been referenced in SI articles when talking about.
Strange coincidence.
Did you do this because you knew that she was going to be on the cover next week?
Yes, it was all me. It was all, no. You know when I found out that she was going to be on the cover? I found out when the UFC tweeted it out the morning it was out there. This is. This is the way.
I have a hard time believing that.
This is the way things work. I mean, and you used to work at ESPN. There were all the time. Sometimes, there's a small circle of people that they include because they wanted to tell Rousey about it while she was on the SI Now TV show.
She didn't know.
She did not know. She was sitting there. And with Maggie Gray, and they were doing the interview, and all of a sudden, right behind them, just like we have this MMA Beat behind us, the big SI cover shows up, and they caught her off guard because she really had no response. And then when the UFC tweeted it out, I had no response because all these people were saying, well, now we know why you ranked her #1, and they even used the exact same language that I used. I mean, my story said something about how she was not just the most dominant fighter in MMA or women's fighter or fighter overall, but she was the most dominant athlete in sports, and they used that exact same language, but I knew nothing about it.
Does this bother you?
Yeah, it actually does. I wanted to know. I wanted to know, partly because I started getting people coming at me saying, how much did the UFC pay you to do this? And of course, my response is not enough.
Right.
But yeah. So I mean, I would have liked to known about it.
So you feel like
I want to know.
This is a slap in the face.
Yeah,
you want to be a part of that inner circle, and I don't blame you.
Come on, people.
Where's the love, SI?
Come on, Sports Illustrated.
Come on. This is your SI MMA writer. There's only one, right?
Well, yeah, Loretta Hunt is sort of in and out,
Okay,
so
well, you're the consistent one.
Yeah, I'm the one.
You should be involved in these discussions.
But I will say,
John Wertheim, writer, fantastic.
John is a fantastic writer, and
wrote a book on MMA.
And he's done a lot of things that related to MMA in the magazine. It's great that he's done this. I don't think that. I mean, look, you look at the cover and it says UFC right on her,
great.
but. This is a Ronda Rousey story. We could say, yeah, MMA's on the cover, but it is, as you were saying, Howard Stern, all these different things. Ronda Rousey has become, she's in the Ronda Rousey business right now, and the UFC is sort of, the UFC is water surf, is water skiing behind her because, they are loving this. And I don't know how much it is going to spill over to the rest of the promotion, but this is a Ronda Rousey story.
And Luke, we'll get to you in a second on this. I know you want to weigh in, but Chuck, I have to ask you, and you bring up a great point. I think it's a sign of the times. I think it's good that they're water skiing behind her because in the past, in 2007, it was all about those 3 letters. People will buy pay-per-views because it was UFC, but now it needs to be about the stars. That's why people will buy these shows.
But I think to some extent, sadly, I think what you said is actually still true with a few exceptions.
Sure. It should be that way. That should be the norm. What I want to ask you, and let's pretend like our SI guy isn't here. I saw some people trying to say like this isn't a big deal. In 2015, this is not significant. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a proud subscriber since I was 9 years old, from Montreal to Syracuse to New York.
You got the fleece.
I got it all.
Yeah.
The VHSs, the whole thing. And I think this is still a huge piece of news. I think it's very significant. Do you agree?
100%. Where would the UFC be right now, honestly? We always talk about Dana always says that, we're not worried about stars come out of the sport. That's what happens. New stars, we lose some, Chuck Liddell retires, whatever, a new star emerges. It's been slow process to bring these guys. If there is no Conor McGregor and no Ronda Rousey right now, imagine the landscape. It would be a lot of guys there would be some guys who have some intrigue, but they wouldn't be to this level. Ronda Rousey right now is a celebrity. The most important thing about her is that the most significant thing in my mind is she's just the way she's been handling it. We've seen her maturity. She's actually now understands the game well. She handles all of her celebrity duties and keeps it separate from her fight duties, and even though they're intersected, I've just been really impressed with the way she's handled herself through this whole process, and that she's taken on these platforms. I feel like she's just matured really over eyes. I remember writing an article back a long time ago about her comments on the Sandy Hook thing and things like that. It seemed like there was a lot more to rein in back then. I feel like she understands her role now, but she compartmentalizes that. She knows essentially why she is where she is. She has a good grasp of realism on how to handle it, and I think the UFC is like, with her and Conor McGregor, just like, thank God that this person is on our roster at this point.
What impresses me most about her is that she still has yet to look at her Twitter mentions since The Ultimate Fighter. Wow, that takes a lot
That's healthy.
Yeah, oh, good for her.
Very
well
healthy.
done. I wish I had that kind of power. Luke, let me ask you about the big selling point. I think it was brilliant because it got people talking about the magazine. They called her on the cover the most dominant athlete in the world. Correct me if I'm wrong. You take exception.
Wait. Before you go, Luke, let me take my earpiece out. Okay, go ahead, Luke.
You take exception with this?
I do, but let me just say something really quickly. I think if people don't read Sports Illustrated or they're from another country, they don't quite get it. I understand, but I just want to say up front, it's a huge deal that she is on the cover of this thing. She is a credit to combat athletes everywhere. In MMA and in combat sports generally, you see a lot of interesting and unique stories, so I think we kind of take it for granted. But it's not just what she's done in the sport. Her story is incredible, and John Wertheim is one of the better guys to tell it, although I certainly would have been happy to have Jeff Wagenheim tell it as well. This is a crowning achievement for her. It's certainly an achievement for MMA, and it's definitely an achievement for the UFC. And I think anyone who doesn't say that is just not up to date with the facts. Look, if they're trying to sell magazines by saying she's the most dominant athlete in sports, I'm not going to take issue with it. But if they're actually trying to make a claim, a real world claim, I think it's ludicrous. If I'm just being honest. Look, if your definition of dominance is the absolute or aggregate distance between two things, you're not telling the world anything. Right? Because when you talk about dominance in sports, particularly professional sports, particularly professional elite sports, dominance is not a substitute for greatness, but it is a component of it. If all you're actually doing is saying, well, the distance between X and the distance between Y is far, right? Luke Thomas can go to the local elementary school and beat the hell out of a bunch of kids by dunking on them on a smaller hoop. You're going to say, well, look, that's an absurd example. And I'm going to say it is an absurd example. But it's the kind that a definition of dominance that's just an absolute distance between two things allows for. Dominance, look at the male side of the sport, or any sports. Dominance is an accumulation of tiny victories. Because when you have actually the very best all competing together, it is impossible to get cartoonish dominance like that. It doesn't exist. When the Rangers and Henrik Lundqvist can win Game 7s by the thinnest of margins, but do it year after year after year after year, that's dominance. When the Chicago Bulls, I'm sorry, Ariel, can beat the likes of John Starks and Patrick Ewing in playoff game after playoff game, but by battling tooth and nail, that's dominance. But when you have, winning in 96 seconds, that is an indictment, and it's not Rousey's fault because she's an elite technician and an elite athlete. That's not a measurement of greatness. That's just a measurement of the distance between things. And I really think you have to take into account when other elite women and other elite technicians come over, who, by the way, I think Rousey will still beat, that's a better representation.
Chuck, agree or disagree?
No, I agree with him. Ultimately, we've talked about this last week a little bit, and unfortunately, Ronda Rousey in her weight class and who she's faced, I get his point. You have to see a long sustained, and you have to see two. We have not seen the opponents that Ronda Rousey has defeated sustain any kind of greatness themselves, is what I'm trying to say. So there's no context to see if she beats Alexis Davis and very quickly, or Kat Zingano. They just don't have enough of their own resumes. What his point is like you've seen. 100%, like if it's the Patriots and the Broncos, or like something like that, where these two teams they've sustained greatness for a long time. They meet each other year after year. Brady against that sort of thing. It's like you have more context for it, but. It is sort of dissecting when we talk about the Sports Illustrated thing. It's like you are sort of squinting and looking at it a very specific way. So I see what they're saying there, because she's been dominant in terms of the most simplistic way you could look at it, which is just she's dominated everybody she's fought. But I see Luke's point too.
Final word to Jeff on this. The SI
Well,
guy.
actually, when I took my thing out, it was actually not working. It literally was not hearing it. But I've heard Luke's tired arguments before, so I don't really need
He
this.
actually gave you credit.
Yeah.
He gave you a compliment.
Now, here's what I feel like about this. I mean, rather than defending my own pound for pound or even what the SI covers is, what I'm going to say is this. The SI cover essentially inadvertently created a pound for pound ranking for all sports and said, okay, she's number one for all sports, and we have a name number 2 through 10 or whatever. But this is what sports discussion is about. As long as we can step back and not say that you have an agenda, Luke, or I have an agenda, or somebody else is an idiot because they believe this, or how could you're getting paid by the UFC to believe this, or whatever. All the stupid things we read on Twitter from people, that's the nonsense that we just have to separate and just say, okay, here's your position. You think this person is the best. I think this person's the best, and that's what sports discussions have been about forever. And that's the way they should continue. So SI is essentially, I certainly didn't write it for shock effect. I'm going to assume that the editors over at SI didn't write it for shock effect, although they didn't consult me. So come on, guys. And they did steal my line. But I'm assuming that the SI has been around for a long time. It's had subscribers since you were 9 years old. It's a legitimate, serious magazine. It's not going to put something out there just in order to get responses. But in the end, there's no right or wrong answer here. The answer is, I have this opinion, Luke has that opinion, you have your opinion, you have yours. Let's talk about it. And that's what being a sports fan is about. This is not brain surgery. This is not war or peace. This is sports. This is the when I worked for the Globe for 20-something years, it was called the toy department.
Right.
That's what sports is. So let's treat it like the toy
Whatever
department.
the case, great for Ronda Rousey, great for the UFC, and most importantly, great for SI. It was smart. It was brilliant to put this kind of praise on her, to throw this out there, because it got people arguing. Like I always like to say, the barbershop talk. People love to argue this. Is she in fact? Is she not? I don't think you should take anything away from her accomplishment being on the magazine. I don't think you should take anything away from SI as an institution. I think smart editors do things like that, and you can make a case. You can make a case for it, whether or not it's true. You can make a case for it, and I think that's enough at the end of the day.
Yeah. Better that than Deflategate. Come on.
Yes, I agree. All right, we're out of time. Luke, any final things you want to say from I believe you're at home in Washington?
He's busy dunking on them kids at the playground.
Any final words? We'll give you the last say since you're home, and it's been a rough 24 hours, right?
I have a bunch of third graders. I have to go pound I'm just going to dunk on them and block their shots like I'm Mutombo, and I'm going to give them the finger whack. I would just say really quickly, I think Jeff has a point. It's all debatable. No one's really going to be winning the argument, but it's certainly. I think I just want to make this point. Like whatever your view of dominance and whatever your view of greatness, Ronda Rousey is deserving of the highest level of respect. She has done things for our sport that I didn't think was possible in even our little lifetime. And so we can have these little disagreements and, whatever the case may be, but it is absolutely awesome to be able to witness something like this. And I really think that we're just, as fans and media, completely lucky to be able to bear witness to something like this.
100%. Well said. And my final plug for her book, if you will, I'm not getting paid to do this, you develop a newfound appreciation for her when reading about her. A lot of her story has been well documented, but after actually reading it, it's an amazing story, and it makes everything that she's doing now even that more impressive. So,
Co-authored by her sister, correct?
Her sister, who's a journalist herself, right. Maria Burns-Ortiz, which I think made for a very interesting dynamic because she lived through a lot of this stuff as well. She's not some ghostwriter, right. So
well, probably got a lot more good stuff.
Yep.
I haven't read it yet. I just got it in the mail yesterday, so I'll be on it.
All right. that does it for us. We're off next week due to UFC 187. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Another busy stretch coming up for the UFC and MMA as well. Bellator has a show on Friday, Kendall Grove versus Brandon Halsey for their middleweight title. So we'll have a lot to discuss, as always, in 2 weeks' time. For now, we say goodbye. That is Jeff. That is Chuck. Luke is somewhere in Washington, D.C., still licking his wounds, I presume. And I am Ariel. I say thank you very much for watching once again this week. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Enjoy the fights.